listeners, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm your co-host Tanzim, and I'm joined by a very special co-host Ryma who we've had on our show before, and she's radio presenter and former radio presenter right at the Tempest, contributor to Vice, and she works as a journalist in Melbourne and Sydney for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, based in the newsroom, covering stories that affect the cities and states, and now works in the legal department. And alhamdulillah, we have a very, very special guest in the cave today. So Sana Saeed, she's a host, senior producer who's been at AJplus since 2014. She has a background in media critique and analysis, with her work having appeared in the New York Times, Huffington Post, LA Times, Quartz, Guardian, Salon and AJE. So that's a lot of big names there, mashallah. So assalamu alaikum, Sana. Welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Welcome assalam. Thanks so much for having me. Excited
Anytime. It's actually quite a big honor. Like, I've been following your stuff on Twitter, Facebook, mashallah, because you're very much, I guess, I feel like it's kind of interesting because I remember you made a few posts about something, I think the Malcolm X documentary, and it always feels like the sort of personality you're like representing the Muslim community, and you're already out there on the platform. So, you know what I mean? I can't really describe it. It's like one of those kind of unique figures, I guess, that we can it's sort of representing us in an authentic manner, if that makes sense. So it's definitely
no pressure. No pressure. I mean,
absolutely none, for sure.
I don't actually like to consider myself as representing any community per se. For me, it's always more about like, what are kind of the questions and ideas I can put out that has members of the community kind of thinking more critically about the way we engage in like politics or media and whatnot. So I don't like to think of myself as someone who's representative of the community, but rather someone who wants us, I think, to overall think critically about how do we represent ourselves and what does representation actually mean to us ultimately, whether it's political or cultural, media, so on and so forth.
Definitely.
And you know what? I really appreciate the way, well, at least you've always come across to me as someone who is always trying to be authentic, down to earth, and critically engaging. This is quite a surreal moment for me. I'm pretty sure I don't want to embarrass you in any way, shape, or form, but you actually have been, like, mashallah, an inspiration to me, and you kind of came into my life at quite a critical moment when I was actually thinking about giving up on the journalism law route because I was just stuck in a rut and I really couldn't see a way forward. And I think the first time I saw you was your AJplus video breaking down the importance of the 2016 Canadian election, I believe, when Trudeau got first elected. And it was like you were walking outside breaking down why the Harper government was problematic, or the policies that they put in place was detrimental to Canadian betterment. And I just saw that and I was like, you know what? I think I can do this. I think I can do this. If that's the end goal, and mashallah, she got there, I think maybe I can at least replicate or find it on my own terms here. So thank you for being you.
That's very humbling. And I'm glad that my work was able to serve as, kind of hopefully helping you make a decision that, you feel is like the right decision for your life as well. So it's very humbling, and it does mean a lot, because sometimes you're just kind of putting stuff out in the world and you're like, I hope this is having a positive impact on, and especially like as a Muslim woman, I always do think about what impact my work is having on other Muslim women, especially in media, who are at all in the public eye in any way. So it does mean a lot to hear that. Alhamdulillah, thank you.
Anytime. I've just been stalking you ever since. Soz not soz.
I hear that a lot, actually, which you'd be surprised how many conversations or how many people I meet, and the conversation always starts with like, so I've actually been stalking you for a while on social media. And I'm like, okay, I know where this is going.
For sure.
I wanted to ask, like, due to, I guess, nowadays, the dynamics of, I guess, news, because we were speaking about, social media and all that, and with COVID hitting, we've had like a bit of like different dynamics in terms of how, I guess, news reporting is happening. Like I was seeing, like, I guess some of your AJplus videos now, I don't know if you're doing it from your home, but it seems a lot more like kind of a different sort of vibe compared to how it was in the past, I guess. In the recent past, actually. So I just wanted to ask, like, how's news reporting in general been during COVID? Like, is it a lot different? Has news reporting shifted dramatically? What's your sort of take? Because a lot of people are like, I guess COVID's affected them differently, but I guess you're in a kind of unique industry, and I assume it's affected things a lot more differently, I guess.
Yeah, it's weird in terms of like being, a producer, a journalist in the midst of COVID, and especially the very particular work that I do. And I've been filming from my apartment, which I was also a little uncomfortable with to an extent because, it's my apartment. It's something I try to, sometimes when you're even a little bit public in this day and age, you actually lose a lot of privacy. And so my apartment is like, my little haven that I've created. And so it was a little weird for me to kind of open up so I've picked a very particular spot in my apartment that I'm like, okay, this is all I really want to show instead of the rest, just because, it's like, I want to keep it a little private. But yeah, you do end up having to, because of the nature of the work that I do, and especially being an on-camera personality, it's like you do, like in this particular context, you have to let people in, right? Because we're all inside, right? So unless you have, I know there are some like news anchors who've been able to go to their studios and whatnot and work from there. But our company, we went remote March 12th, essentially. March 12th, March 13th. We pretty much went entirely remote starting then. And since then, we were trying to figure out how do we do this. In terms of producing content, I think that's also been really tough because consumer or viewer habits rather aren't the same. So people, even me, right? Like even though I'm a quote unquote content creator, I'm a producer. I work behind the camera as well in front of it, but I also consume a lot of content, and even my own, the way I consume content has really changed. I went from like really binge watching a lot of like Netflix and Hulu I went almost a month without watching anything, or month and a half or something, without watching anything at all on Netflix or Hulu. And I don't know why that was the reason, but I had zero desire to do it. And I think like what we're trying to figure out, just like anyone, is like, what do people want to watch right now? Right? Initially, there was a lot of interest in a lot of COVID content. And I don't do COVID content. My job currently was, I was producing kind of cultural histories and critiques on pop culture. So that's kind of what I had been working on, a project of mine for the last year. And now we're like, my company was like, you know what, Sana, let's kind of put you also in a little bit more of a commentary position. Like, let's see how that goes with our, limited resources, like every newsroom. And so so right now we're kind of in this weird spot where we're trying to figure out like, what is it that the audience wants? And I think a lot of, at least here in the United States, I can't speak for elsewhere, but I think especially here, a lot of people are trying to figure out what is the kind of content that people want to consume from specifically news organizations as well, because I think everyone's kind of tired of the gloom and doom of COVID, but it's not normal yet entirely either. So it's like, what is that? And I think that's a question we're constantly exploring and trying to figure out. And yeah.
For sure, I can definitely relate to that, because one of the struggles that I've personally been dealing with while working remotely as well, that I've been really struggling to try to delineate, is really trying to find that divide between the personal and professional, because at least when you were on site, whether you were filming or working or researching, whatever second or third degree trauma that comes with dealing or reporting on stories, you were able to at least separate physically and leave behind on site. And you were able to, I guess, have that support network ready in terms of more experienced journalists or producers, EPs that you were able to have these discussions with and really unpack. However, once I brought that into my house, I'm working out of my room. I've been working out of my room for the past 4 months, and it's really done a number on me because I can't seem to find that balance. It's like I'm bringing that trauma directly into my house. And I'm sure, as you're aware, what we publish outside, or at least publish externally for the audience based on what we think they need to know, is essentially whittled down to essential facts, or sometimes teased out into more meaningful content. But the bulk of it right? What gets edited out, extracted, that still sits with us, and we have to sit there and sift through that information. So I was just wondering, how have you been finding it mentally and emotionally, trying to delineate between the two?
It's been hard. It's so hard. I think the first couple of months were emotionally the toughest. And I remember even we had a bunch of newsroom meetings, and I made a point to say, I said, I think we should remember that we're not just a newsroom that's reporting on a story. We're living this story. This is not just a story that we are kind of getting information from the wire or kind of going on the ground and asking people what's going on, but that this story has impacted every single one of us very personally. And we shouldn't forget that or lose sight of that. And that mental health is absolutely paramount. And so there's that element of it. There's that aspect of it, which is that this isn't a story. And I think also as journalists, like we are in tune with the news, like in terms of how much we consume on a daily basis. I think we do it at an exponential amount, right?
We're
Compared
practically
to
news junkies. We can't turn
we're
off.
Absolutely. We're like complete news junkies. And even if I'm like making an active effort to not read the news every day, I read absolutely. And if I go an entire weekend without checking my Twitter, which is impossible, but if I don't check my Twitter, I don't check the headlines, Sunday night or Monday morning, I catch up on everything anyways. Right. And so when you are living the story, so you're living this kind of collective trauma and experience of this pandemic and the uncertainty that's come with it. And then on top of that, you're also creating content that's related to it, or maybe it isn't related to it. And you kind of feel like, this is weird. I feel like I should be doing something that's really related to what's happening in the world right now. And then on top of that, you are also a consumer of news, and in a way that is very voracious. It's a lot on your mental health, on your heart. And as this pandemic's gone on, with me personally, I've had a lot of losses in my family directly related to COVID. And so that on top of everything else, it's really hard. And I hope that our newsrooms are doing more across the board to recognize that it's not business as usual, but that rather, like, journalists are oftentimes, we do have a lot of secondhand or thirdhand trauma as well, right? And it's not necessarily if we're just doing the story and producing a video or writing it, but even just the proximity we have to these stories, whether through our personal lives or through, just our consumption of it, it takes a toll on you. And I think that there's a reason why I see in my personal circles, a lot of people are leaving the industry. I mean, it was already kind of a shift before, like a lot of people were leaving journalism and the industry because they were just sick of it, and for many different reasons. I think the last 4 years in the United States have been extremely emotionally and physically difficult and heavy. But now I think people are like, I can't do this. Like, yeah, I have a job right now and it's paying the bills, and that's great. And that's what I need. I need my healthcare, et cetera. But I think for a lot of us, there's a lot of journalists who are thinking about, what's my move after this? Because this is too much. This is too much for anyone to take on for their mental health.
For sure. I 100% relate to that. And it's strangely cathartic to be talking about this as well, especially, trying to relate as well to your audience. As you said, we're all experiencing this collectively, but there's just a lot of delineations. And again, as you've said, there is this industry-wide burnout. And I don't know about you personally, but speaking from the perspective of someone that works at a public broadcaster, in Australia at least, the ABC is very much similar to the BBC. There's no licensing fee, but because our budget does come from government, we have an actual legislation that dictates our charter and the principles that we need to basically abide by to provide to the Australian people. And one of the clauses is to inform, educate, and entertain all Australians. But this industry-wide burnout that I've at least witnessed on this side of the world, specifically from a public broadcaster perspective, is that the toll it takes, especially in those initial stages, I reckon from February onwards, at least until April, 90%, if not 100% of the energy was dedicated just to prevent or at least combat misinformation online. It's basically taken all of my energy reserves because I felt like I was battling it on two fronts. So the ABC would just be running live blogs daily. They just temporarily shut it down, and then because of the state of Victoria and New South Wales with the re-emergence of cases and stage 4 lockdown, specifically in Victoria, the live blog just went up. But essentially, we're just like burning through people, trying to get live updates from government, also trying to dispel myths, also trying to disprove hoaxes, fake videos, fake content that has just been disseminating through WhatsApp. And so you're kind of doing that for 8 hours a day. And then, you quote unquote come home, and then you've got your parents or elders in your community, you go into your personal Facebook, and it's like you're waging that battle all over again because that very same misinformation that you tried so hard to dispel because it's damaging gets resurfaced in your personal life. So I was just wondering if you also felt the same way and how you're dealing with it, particularly as this pandemic essentially forced us all to connect virtually.
Sorry, can you just repeat the last part of the question again?
So essentially, the point was, for you personally, how has it been trying to combat the spread of misinformation, particularly as we're all essentially forced to connect virtually online?
The misinformation thing is the most frustrating thing I think I've experienced in a very long time, and that includes an American election in 2016. Like, there is so much misinformation across the board, and not just like here in the United States, where it's absolutely like I think I've given up all hope about even trying because I'm like it's everyone has their theories and conspiracies, and sure I think there's a lot of questions that need to be asked, absolutely, and I think we should always be questioning things and thinking critically. But unfortunately, a lot of times, especially here in the United States, that's led to a situation where we have the highest number of coronavirus cases. Our daily toll is horrifying. What's happening in hospitals in the United States is horrifying, and it's because no one's taking it seriously anymore. If you were to we haven't even peaked yet, right? Like that's the crazy part. The United States has not really peaked, and because a peak means that like you're coming down. The cases are going to come down, and they're not. So we haven't peaked yet. And you walk outside, I walk outside in my neighborhood and it feels like there's no pandemic at all, right? That maybe people are wearing masks because there was like some people are wearing masks and it feels like, oh, maybe there was a fire nearby. Like there's no kind of real, a sense of not panic. That's not the word, but no sense of kind of like, hey, we're all in this together and we kind of need to take this a lot more seriously than we are, versus, hey, I just want to live my life and have a good time. And it doesn't help, that we're in the summer and whatnot. And that's really kind of made people buy into this idea that maybe it's not as bad as it's being made out to seem, even though the numbers are showing us exactly how bad it is. So here in the United States, like I kind of try to do what I can, and I just try to stick with like, talking about the numbers, talking about, first person stories and experiences. And also like as I mentioned earlier, in my own family, I've had quite a few losses in just 2.5 months related to COVID. And, I kind of point to that and say, tell me where the hoax is, right? Like, tell me where the lies are. I can speak to it directly. I mean, I lost my uncle last week, and I'm like, I can speak directly to what he experienced and what my family went through, and kind of all those things that people are saying, or this is a hoax, or this is overblown, et cetera. I can speak to what was happening in that hospital, where he was, and how hospitals, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's in Pakistan, like how overwhelmed they are and unprepared they are really ultimately to deal with these mass numbers. This is not a hoax for population control. But at the same time, I do think we need to be aware of like the fact that I do think governments will absolutely take advantage of this moment to kind of, encroach on our rights and freedoms. So we do need to be vigilant, and we can be vigilant about that without, going outside without wearing a mask, for instance. I think it's very possible to do that. And then in my own family, it's been like, I get those WhatsApp forwards, and I just had to be really, really tough on my parents, on my other family members. I was in the WhatsApp groups, and I was like, you guys can't keep doing this. I'm like, I understand that like there's all this information coming and you don't know how to sift through it properly, but this is some random dude, I don't know where he is, and he's telling you that this is going to cure coronavirus. I'm like, it's just not true. It's not true. And so they've gone a bit like better with that, I think, as they themselves have seen firsthand the impact of the virus on our family. And so I think that's been a really sobering experience where they're like, yeah, we do need to be a bit more critical about the information that we're consuming. And it's really sad that that's what it's like for so many people, that they don't take it not necessarily as seriously, but they don't take it as critically and as seriously, the information that they're receiving, until they've actually seen someone go through it.
Exactly, for sure. Those are really, really great points. And I think it just touches on that aspect of human nature, is that it's essentially out of sight, out of mind until it happens to you, which is really sad, because I don't think that's the right approach to be having it. We shouldn't have to wait until there's a crisis last minute in order to adapt, or in order to learn from mistakes, essentially. But I wanted to slightly switch gears, still stay on the same topic, but I also couldn't help but notice, as well I'm sure you have, with trends, is that as much as COVID tends to take over headlines and has been the central discussion for the past few months, it's also being used essentially as a distraction, or it's being centered willingly while certain things are being conducted in the background, or at least trying to get away without public interest or suspicion, if so to speak. And I wanted to speak specifically to the impact it's had on the media industry, at least. Here in Australia, it's been one of the most massively hit industries, at least in my opinion. We've actually had entire newsrooms shut down. So the Australian arm of BuzzFeed has been closed. The AAP, or at least the Australian arm of the Associated Press, was about to be shut down as of June, but they got a last-minute bailout from one of the media commercial companies here. But even in my own workplace, we're facing a redundancy of 250 jobs, and that's just with the first phase of government cuts that have essentially been coming for years now, but it's really been put into place under COVID because of budgetary concerns, or at least that's how the government's pushing it. And I just wanted to know, or get your thoughts on that, because it just seems to me that, it's easy to write this off as an economic impact, so to speak. Everyone's losing their jobs. You shouldn't read into it. It's going to come. It's going to be worse before it gets better. But I just can't help but think that this might be governments around the world essentially not wasting a crisis and taking their chance at trying to whittle down the fourth estate. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a good chance of that. I mean, going back to my previous point that I made, that I think we are in a moment where governments absolutely are taking advantage of the fact that there is fear, or that there is kind of this moment where people are maybe more often than not willing to listen to the government because they're trying to stay alive. People are afraid. They're trying to stay safe. So they're giving a bit more leeway in terms of like how much control the government has on our lives, right? Like, we all kind of collectively came together, and pretty much, I mean, except in the United States, I guess, but like, we're like, yeah, okay, we should all wear face masks. Oh yeah, we should like stay 6 feet apart, or, oh yeah, we shouldn't go out. We kind of, a lot of us in the world kind of collectively came together and abided by these rules. And I think that what we always need to be kind of conscious of is how sometimes that necessary obedience can also become unnecessary obedience, right? Which governments will always take advantage of, which goes back to, again, my earlier point, which is that, we need to be we need to listen very carefully to the scientists, the doctors about what's going on, and do what we can to keep everyone safe. But we also have to be really critically engaged with kind of like, how far will this go, right? Like in terms of like governments taking certain actions and having our consent because we are in a state of fear, right? And this is what would be called like a state of exception. And then whatever happens in this state of exception, it becomes the new normal. And I think that's something we have to definitely be aware of in terms of like media. I mean, we don't have as much government involvement in our media here, but instead we have very corporate media here. And I do think that we for a very long time in the United States have had a complete crushing of the media industry, in particular the journalism industry, right? So in the last how many years? In the last like 5-6 years alone, you've seen massive layoffs across major news companies, especially digital news companies. Print in particular has suffered a lot. You've seen entire newsrooms shut down. Even right now, like for example, The Atlantic let go 70 people, which was almost the entirety of their video team, right? Which was huge because The Atlantic was actually doing some incredible work when it came to digital video documentaries and whatnot. And that was a surprise to all of us. That the fact that they completely gutted that entire department. But at the same time, it's not surprising because I do think a lot of newsrooms are taking advantage, or a lot of news companies are also taking advantage of the fact that this is a kind of uncertain moment, including economically. And so they are taking it to maybe speed up cuts that they would have done anyways, right? Because that's the other thing is the people who end up getting cut, they're not the executives, right? They're the people who actually make the content, who do the reporting. And I do think it's a weird time to be a journalist, more so than usual, because, you don't know really if you're going to have a job in the following week. Like that's, in terms of all my friends who are in the industry, that's kind of the mindset we're all in and including myself and others, right? Like you don't know because there are decisions being made, so quickly and unexpectedly across the industry that you don't know if you're going to have a job in, the following week. And I think it's a scary time, whether it's by design or not, it's hard to say. But I think that when we emerge from this pandemic, which won't be for a very, very long time, it's not like 2021 is going to come and we're going to be like, whoa, everything's normal. I mean, even if we were to get a vaccine, let's say, by some miracle, by let's say 2021, we have a vaccine, that's not going to be available and accessible to everyone very easily. And that won't necessarily, right, ensure that things are going to quote unquote go back to normal. It's actually going to take a very, very long time. I mean, people may live relatively normal lives, whatever normal is. But in terms of work, the economy, those things are still going to take a bit time to reset. And so I think when we ultimately emerge from this pandemic in a few years, we're going to see a media industry that is going to be, especially in the United States, and that's really the only one I can speak to because obviously that's my experience. But we're going to emerge to an industry that is extremely different because it was forced to be different because of the unique situation that the pandemic presents, but also because of, business decisions, quote unquote, that were made that were possibly rooted in issues well before, COVID-19 even became a reality for us, right? But I do think that from all of this, the media industry, the news industry is going to emerge radically different. And it's kind of a bit of I think we've been having kind of a reckoning moment, but I think it's going to be interesting to see where we are in 3 to 4 years.
Exactly, for sure. It's definitely a moment of reckoning here as well. And it is quite different, essentially. I don't have any corporate media experience here in Australia, but I can at least safely say that from the perspective of public broadcasting, which I feel has a much larger importance, at least here in Australia, because it's fundamental and exists in its own charter, that it is quite uncertain, not in terms of just the economic forefront. At least there is some kind of certainty in knowing that because it's specifically legislated and it is essentially a central tenet of Australian media, that it's always going to be there. But as I'm sure you've probably seen within the last year, my workplace got raided, which was fun, by the Australian Federal Police, June of last year. That was actually the day of raid. I remember walking into the office the next day, and it was just absolute pandemonium because I was in legal at the time. So obviously the police essentially dealt with our department the most, and it was a strange kind of civil affair in which, they're buying our lawyers coffee and sandwiches while they're also asking the IT guy, hey, can you just hand over 9,000 documents that pertain to this particular search warrant, which was just really, really odd. But the ramifications of that really at least shocked Australia for last year. And it seemed like there was this momentum building to try and cement a probable defense, or at least a reliable defense for public interest journalism in the constitutional background of not essentially having a clear freedom of speech right. It's always been implied in Australia. There's no such thing as a clear Bill of Right where it says you have the right to freedom of speech. It only says in the Constitution that you've got a right to political communication. And that's been read down very narrowly, which I think shocked a lot of people because at least, in Australia, or at least its perception worldwide, it always seems to contradict with the reality. So you think of Australia and you think of laid back, larrikin, doesn't take themselves too seriously, friendly, kind of just goes with the flow. But when you look at it from a legal perspective, we're one of the most, or at least in my experience, we've become more stricter than the UK, and we essentially inherited that same common law system. And that applies to every aspect of life. So it tends to be quite strict. And once people realized that there was no freedom of speech protection and that the government, or at least the executive arm, were able to come in and raid because it was legal to, it kind of woke a lot of people up. But since the pandemic hit, they were actually able to charge one of the journalists for the stories that they were trying to get them in for, which was on the potential war crimes that Australian soldiers have committed in Afghanistan, ironically enough. So they've just been referred to be charged, and this would be probably the first time, at least I think in media history, that it's ever happened to a journalist. And they were able to speed this up because of COVID. All of these developments were happening in the background in addition to these cuts, which was quite worrying. But then it also brings me to my next point, because if this is happening in the background here, and you and I were essentially feeling it on this particular level, it's obviously a whole other discussion when it comes to the Muslim world, and in the extent to which they're now cracking down on journalists because they can, in the background of this pandemic, because a lot of revolutionary movements, right, have just kind of came to a grinding halt. Sudan, Algeria, Eastern Africa, the Middle East, they just obviously shut down as soon as COVID hit. But now governments are basically taking advantage of this and arresting journalists or even people with public platforms on social media. Do you think that when it comes to the Muslim world and its consolidation of power, that this is going to be another permanent shift in trying to silence dissent?
I don't think it's going to be something, I don't think it is something that's going to be or is unique to, Muslim societies and countries. I think perfect example is here in the United States. Since I believe May 27th and May 28th, we've had mass protests, right? We've had a huge movement sparked by the killing of George Floyd. And what we've seen in this country, I mean, I remember those first 2 weeks, I genuinely thought that this was going to explode into something like the kind of state violence, right? Because people forget that police are also like in the United States, right? And anywhere, they're also state actors essentially. But the kind of violence that we were seeing, not only against civilians, right? Not only against protesters, peaceful protesters, but also against journalists, right? I don't know if you heard, but there were a lot of journalists who were arrested while literally doing their job. We had journalists who were assaulted by police. And I remember watching it and I was like, this is insane to watch. This is so crazy to watch because these are the type of things that people always think are in the history books and it's not going to happen again. And it's absolutely happening. And even that's continued, right? Like we've seen, I don't know how much you've been following it, but we've seen, footage coming out of Portland, right? Portland, which I don't know how much you know about it, but it's basically like the whitest city in the United States, right? Portland has this very popular reputation of being like very white and like very hippie and very organic. And, that's like how people think about Portland. Like, oh, you want to go surfing, go to Oregon. And it's very, has that kind of a reputation. All of a sudden now you have these protests happening in Portland, which is still blowing my mind that they're happening there, but in the way that they're happening there. But you've had like these stories emerge where you have federal officers are picking up protesters in unmarked vehicles. They're just picking up protesters. That's what they were doing. And it became a huge headline. Now, that's nothing new. Like we in the United States in particular, especially, have a history of that, right? Like in the early, after 9/11, in New York in particular, almost, I believe, 1,000 or over 1,000 Muslim men and quote unquote Muslim adjacent men, aka Sikh men or Hindu men who were seen to be perceived to be Muslim, were picked up by unmarked vehicles and tortured and interrogated for weeks, for months. No one knew where they were. And, there was even a lawsuit as recent as 2015 that like around almost 800 of these men actually filed against the US government. So this is something that's been a part of this country for a very, very long time. So I think we are actually going to see a lot more of that. And I don't think it's new. I think we're just going to see it perhaps more unabashedly, right? And I think we are going to see, if COVID worsens in other countries, especially, I think we will see a tightening of that kind of authoritarian government action, whether it's here in the United States or it's in a country like Pakistan, for instance, or wherever. And I don't think unfortunately, I don't think that's entirely avoidable. Right? Because ultimately the government is the government, the state is the state because it has that monopoly on violence more than anyone else. So it's, and that's what I mean. I think like we're in really scary times for various reasons. And it doesn't start with COVID. It's something that started a very, very long time ago. And I think it's just, some of us are maybe opening our eyes a bit more to like the fact that, oh, this is where it's going to go. And it can get really, really bad. Have you seen the movie Children of Men?
Yes, I have.
So
I know you're going this. Yep.
Yeah, that movie is always like, I remember when it came out in theaters, I saw it and I was like, oh my God, this is the world we live in. And now in like 2020, I'm like, this is the world we live in. Like the thing I love about that movie is that it is meant to be dystopic and in the future. And yet it's very much so in the present. And actually like the director of the film, Alfonso Cuarón, actually talks about how he very much so wanted to like kind of answer the question, what if the dystopia we always feared is the one we live in? And I think about that question all the time in these times is that there is no, it will get worse, right? We are in that worse constantly. And the only thing that changes ultimately is our knowledge of it, really, right? And, yeah. So I unfortunately have a really bleak outlook on all of this. And by the way, let me know if I get too rambly or anything. Like I can do that.
No, I can just hear you talk. I can just listen to you talk forever. I'm just like, I'm absorbing everything. Please give me all these golden nuggets.
You're too
no.
I can, but let me know if you want me to rephrase anything, like make it more concise so it's easier for you guys when you're editing it, just let me know. Like I know how it goes. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, of course. But I'm sure I think we've all all of a sudden gotten an appetite for longer form, more detailed content because we suddenly have the time to digest it. So don't self-censor, don't try to re-edit. I'm ready.
Sure,
I'm taking
So I just want to make sure that the point that I'm making is like clear for people as well, right?
Yeah,
I
of course.
Make sure for that reason.
Yeah. If I do need any clarification, of course I'll prompt you. But so far, everything you're saying, I'm just like, yes, nodding along. This is exactly the line I'm taking. And I think this can actually segue into an interesting point for at least for both of us, because at least for me anyway, Muslim representation in media, specifically in journalism, at least here, is quite young. To be honest, I don't think I've ever had a Muslim journalist to look up to as a mentor of sorts. There's no essential network or support. I'm essentially, or, like many of us here, at least in Australia, I'm essentially running in blind because there's a lot of conversation around trying to diversify media, making sure we've got quote unquote accurate representation and what that entails. But I really strongly feel that once you get through the door, it's like a giant question mark. It's like, now what? Now, how do I move? Where do I go?
Yeah.
How do I balance? How do I balance my responsibilities as a journalist and try to reconcile that with my faith? And especially when when your faith is the topic of conversation, it also gets way more tricky, at least in my experience. In terms of our role, I feel like there's probably a really big difference between national and international media in terms of the roles that we perform and the values that we bring to those platforms. In your experience working both domestically and now internationally for Al Jazeera, do you feel that there is a difference in the way that you operate with this in mind?
With what in mind in particular?
As in trying to, at least with like the role of the Muslim journalist, as much as we try to, our point is to inform people, to make sure that they've got facts, that they know what's going on, but, you can't separate the fact, or at least
of course.
Nowadays you can't separate that.
Absolutely. You can't separate when you exist. This is my problem oftentimes with like the way that journalism is also structured. It's very white. And by white, I don't mean just like the people, but I mean in terms of the experiences. And I'm like, when you exist in when your identity and your faith is politicized, it is very hard for that to not play a role in the work that you do. Like, simply put, it's very, very hard for me to not have, feelings about certain things, whether it's how stories about Muslims are told, or even the experts, quote unquote, that we'll get sometimes and whatnot. It's very hard to separate yourself. I'm like, that is a real luxury, to be able to separate yourself, especially when you're living as a minority in a country, to separate yourself from your work, especially when it's the work of like, it's in the business of disseminating information and providing information about the world, about communities, about politics, and so on and so forth, to separate that from who you are and how you exist in that particular context, the world, the country that you're in, and so on and so forth. So for me, the reason why I even wanted to become a journalist in the first place, right, was because I was very much so like, it wasn't about Muslim representation for me. It was about how stories are told, right? So I never had any interest, by the way, like being on camera or anything of that sort. I was just more interested in because my background is as a writer. So I just wanted to write good stories. And so I was very focused on the storytelling aspect of it. And, having been I was, I think 13 or 14 when 9/11 happened. And that played a massive role in my starting to pay more attention to the way that media narratives were constructed, specifically also about Muslims. And I, was really, really paying attention to that. And because I'm like, I don't recognize the Islam and the Muslims they talk about on the news. Like, what is this? I don't understand this. And so I started paying, attention to a lot more. My first year of college, there was the whole Danish cartoon controversy. There were also the quote unquote riots in France that happened in 2005. And that I remember looking at the way in which those stories were being told in the media. And I became just a lot more interested in narrative construction about communities and about the way and how that impacts not just how we view those communities, but also how that has a direct impact on support for certain detrimental policies, whether domestic or foreign. So for me, as like a Muslim woman journalist, I can't separate that history of mine, that experience of mine, what I've witnessed as a news consumer. I can't separate that from being a journalist and what my job is. And to your point about like even the mentorship, I agree. I think it's like really unfortunate that we don't really have that. And that's something like I know I would like to do, because I feel unfortunately, like definitely here in the United States, there is this mentality of like, there's only room for one, which is kind of like really bizarre to me. This idea that there can only be one Muslim American who does this and that's it. And then they're the ones we have forever. And it's like, what? Like, it's so weird to me. Like, and there's also always this striving for being the first Muslim, whatever, right? It's a really weird dynamic to me. And I'm like, I don't like, if those are our priorities, then we're never actually going to have any kind of political clout and power in any material sense in this country or in the world, really. But I do think it's really unfortunate that we don't have real systems of mentorship that, take people under their wing and kind of, like because here in the United States, we do have Muslim American journalists who are older, right? Who are in their late 30s, 40s, even 50s, because they started in the late 90s, early 2000s, So we have like at least a generation of Muslim American journalists who can speak to it, but we don't have those institutions in place that connect us, right? And I wholly agree with you. Like we need that because navigating journalism as a Muslim, not just as a Muslim in terms of like, this is my politicized identity, but even in terms of practice of your faith is tough because the journalism industry isn't really built for, practicing Muslims as well, right? In terms of how we socialize, in terms of how we maybe build relationships with other journalists. It's not really built that way. And so that's always a struggle as well, is like, how do I how do I practice my faith and stay true to it and its principles while also remaining a journalist and doing my job?
That's exactly it. And it's that essential double bind, I feel, that especially if you're more practicing, that you tend to struggle with more. Because another thing that I find a bit more destabilizing, or at least for me anyway, is that I'm visibly Muslim. I'm one of maybe 2, possibly 3 Muslim journalists or workers at the ABC alone that employs probably 4,000 people who are actually visibly Muslim with a headscarf on. And it's almost impossible to actually even get a conversation without having that being brought into it, because my visible Muslimness essentially is going to dictate how well I fit into the industry. And that also gets juxtaposed with, say, Muslims who tend to, or at least, approach their journalism or the way that they work with the more of a cultural lens. So they may not be as practicing or what have you, and the way that they tell their stories might lean more towards those essential narrative constructions that we're trying to undo at times. And I feel like I get stuck because it's essentially sometimes undermining what I'm trying to do or what I'm trying to undo in this instance. And it's definitely about trying to, keep those values without essentially coming to a compromise. But it's really, really difficult. And I don't know how to balance this, as well as you said, without, trying to be the first quote unquote person to do this, which is, like you said, it's totally detrimental, because it just, for me at least, it just signals that we weren't able to do anything. We had no power to do anything beforehand. And now that we're the first, just signals how late we are to the game, or how many barriers were in place, suggesting that we were probably regressive before we made it to that. And I don't think that should be the standard that we're trying to aim for as a community. But I also feel like it also comes down to the diversity hire, or at least trying to get this quota, or at least this numerical quota this numerical quota of making sure that there is enough people to represent and do the work. But it just falls on them at the end of the day. And, when you're dealing with structures that are predominantly white, and like you said, from the executive top down, there's not really any change. You're going to get fallouts, like from the Black Lives Matter movement, such as what we've seen with Condé Nast, and recently here with SBS, which is the public broadcaster that specializes for multicultural communities, and particularly for Indigenous and multicultural communities. And recently there have been a lot of journalists who have come forward with their Indigenous journalists who have come forward with racism that they've experienced that was so debilitating that it forced them to leave the industry. So I just wanted to know, at least from your perspective, when we're dealing with this double bind, how do you think we should move forward, or at least try to function, and as well trying to undo this whole structure internally?
So the question is a really good question, and it's a tough question, because I don't know how you really undo that structure from within. Because unfortunately, I think even any kind of rectifying that we're seeing currently of these issues that have been brought up across various media organizations, I think a lot of them ultimately will be more Band-Aid and temporary versus long-term. Because what you're asking for, the reason why structures also exist, it's very circular, right? Where it's these structures exist because you have a certain dominant group, and that dominant group keeps power because these structures exist, right? So because those structures were built by the dominant group, and they were built specifically to keep them dominant. Whether it's something as a corporate structure, or it's a structure of an entire country, or the economic structure, or whatever. So I'm trying to think of how do you actually kind of dismantle something like that. And I wish I had the answer. I don't know. I know you can try to disrupt it. And I think, so one of the things that I try to do in my own company, in my own newsroom, is I've been there for 6 years now. Last Friday was my 6-year anniversary, which was crazy. I'm whoa, I've been here way too long.
Congratulations. That's a lifetime in journalism.
I know, right? And I'm okay.
Wild.
Well, it also speaks to just Al Jazeera is pretty good at keeping you around sometimes. So, I've been at the company, at AJplus in particular, for 6 years. I have a lot of, institutional memory, right? So I can actually speak to a lot of the history of the company and whatnot, because I was there from before launch. I helped launch the company as well. I was part of that entire team that helped launch. And so because of that, and because I know that I have a bit more of a public persona in the company, and I know my own worth. That's the other thing. I know what I've brought to the company and what I continue to bring. I kind of use that position of mine as a means of a launching pad for making, whenever there's particular issues, I use that position of mine to bring those up. So I can't dismantle a system, right? But I can personally use my position of privilege and, some power. It's not a lot of power, but it's some power. And both internally and externally, right? I have this, it sounds a little, I'm going to brag a little bit, but I have a little bit of this, what's the word I'm looking for? I have this kind of a presence outside of AJplus as well that exists, which I know it brings in some power. And I think we have to be able to recognize our own individual power, which I think, especially when we're minority communities, when we're women, we don't do that because we think it is kind of cocky or something of that sort. When in actuality, it's we're recognizing the power that we have and that we are worth far more than oftentimes we're told we're worth. Right. And so because I recognize that and I have to constantly remind myself that, I'm able to use that little power that I have to, speak on behalf of fellow employees and coworkers who maybe don't feel as comfortable speaking out, right? So I try to do that as much as I can. And I think that sometimes in the absence of any plan or ability to dismantle an entire structure from within this industry, I think that's something we can try to do. And I'm also at a point where if there are certain repercussions, I'm willing to also take those on, which I know is like not easy to say always, but and it's very scary to say that because especially in this, economy and the uncertain times. But I am at a place personally in my life where I'm just confident enough to say, you know what, if there are certain repercussions for me taking a particular stand or whatever, so be it. Like I'm willing to kind of take that on if it means like speaking up for people internally within my company or something to their benefit. So yeah. I think that's one way of doing it is that if we recognize that we have a certain kind of power, using that responsibly and in unity and solidarity with those who are our coworkers and especially those who are on the margins, so to speak, internally in our companies. I think that's one way where you're not maybe dismantling it, but you're kind of disrupting it.
That's a good point to take, and especially because it leads me to my next point about, how much we should be speaking up and advocating, at least internally, for some kind of change, but specifically in the sphere of, at least when combating mainstream reporting or how they go about reporting things that come across as Islamophobic, or at least within the narrative structure that the company is adhering to when disseminating such information that indirectly say discriminates against you. At least for me personally, that's what's been jarring at a public broadcaster where a lot of the flagship programs and a lot of the Walkley Award winning or a lot of the hardcore investigations are essentially conducted by white structures and white people, and you become the byproduct of that story and how much we should be, or how much of an expectation there should be on us because we're inside, given how big the industry is, to try and fight that. So, for example, this is one of many instances, but I remember there was a huge investigations story about one particular ISIS fighter that came through legal, and obviously because it's quite problematic, it had to go through the lawyers. And I happened to be in on that story at the time, and I really just couldn't let this one particular thing slide, even though it was just really small. But it was just a detail about how they were describing that when this person left Australia and found themselves in Syria, that they adopted a quote unquote Islamic alias. And I read the sentence and I'm just like, he didn't do that. He just Arabified his name. Like he just de-anglicized it. I'm like, that's how you'd say it in Arabic. Why are we attributing something like this? And I went back and forth as to whether I should speak out, because I was just like, this is just little old me. I'm really insignificant. The journalist who wrote it is like journalism royalty. I'm like, should I really send this email? Should I really speak out? I was worried about the repercussions, and I was just like, you know what? If I'm going to get scared about something like this, what's going to happen when something bigger comes down my way, and it's really going to challenge me as to whether I need to get the story out or I need to stick with my principles. And thankfully, it actually worked out. They apologized so much, for saying that they got such a small detail wrong. But I'm like, if this is just something that we're willing to let go and has gone through the editing process so many times, I really shudder to think at how much we don't know about, or at least I don't know about, that is being told. And I guess it speaks to the culture. But to that point, because we're on the other side of the fence, should there be an expectation that we stop it, given how A, little of us there are in the industry, and B, the emotional and mental toll that it takes trying to wage this internal battle?
I think it comes down to why you're in it to begin with, right? Like, I know I can think of some journalists, Muslim journalists, who are just in it to tell the stories, and they're not interested in taking the nitty gritty and talking about language and whatnot. You know what I mean? Like, that's not their thing. They're like, look, I'm just going to tell the stories that I tell and work on those. And if there's anything maybe egregious, we can talk about it. But so there are people who are just in it to just do the job, and that's it. And then I think there are a lot of us who are in it because, like I said, for myself, the reason I got into the industry was to really upend the ways in which stories about not just Muslims, but about a lot of different minority communities are told, because those are oftentimes the same narratives. Like, for me, it's not just about negative stories that are told about that involve Muslims, but also positive stories that involve Muslims, and the way we frame those and we talk about them. And there's always this, oftentimes in a lot of these stories, whether negative or positive, there's still an othering of Muslims, right? They're always, and the way we've kind of made Muslims into its own like racial category, even though it's like, being a Muslim is not a race. It's just a religion. It's a set of beliefs. So for me, I know personally, I make a point of being that little nitpicky sometimes, right? If I see a video go out that I'm like, this was problematic framing and here's why, and I think like it's a significant one, right? I will go and make that point to the appropriate person. I say, hey, just an FYI for future reference. We said this, but I do think we need to be cognizant that this language is implying this, and so on and so forth. So I don't do it with everything, but I think there have been moments where I've said to myself, okay, say something now. And then my hope is that, by me doing this, that, and I think I'm pretty much the only person who really does this. I can't speak to like just other people I know, and Muslims in my company. I don't think they always do it. I think I spend way too much time doing it, perhaps, relatively speaking. But my hope is that I talk to the appropriate people, right? So I'll talk to the copy editor, I'll talk to the editorial lead, and I'll say, hey, this was a problem. So I don't go directly to the reporter or the person who worked on the video alone. I'll actually go to someone above them who I know is making the editorial decisions. And, I'll say, hey, this was a video we put out. We kind of framed it this way. Here's an issue with how we framed it. I think that we can do this in a much more sharper way editorially. Going forward, let's consider that. And my hope is that when I'm speaking to someone who's editorially in charge, that at some point I don't have to keep going to them, that they actually understand like, oh, that's interesting. Sana brought up this bigger issue about, the way we depicted these Muslim women or whatever. That's something to take into consideration going forward. Right. So I go in with it with that kind of mentality that let me just give you the basics. If you're the editorial person, you're the one making the decisions. I'm not going to do your job for you. I'm not, because this is also unpaid labor, right? Like we also kind of forget that, unfortunately, This is the kind of work that ends up being completely unpaid, unrecognized labor that we're doing, not because because it's our job, because it's not our job. We're doing it because we're like, hey, can you not dehumanize us? Like that's what it is, right? It's about
we
like
humans too, please. Like just pointing that out.
Yeah, and like you wouldn't talk about other human beings in this way, so why are you talking about us in this way, right? And it's like how much, like when the massacre happened in New Zealand, I actually wrote an article for the LA Times about the language that we use in the media. That even oftentimes we will make victims we'll dehumanize them as well. And I was talking about how I noticed that when the news broke about the massacre, the Christchurch massacre, how so many headlines and tweets were about peaceful mosquegoers, right? And I'm like, we don't even stop to consider what does that word mean in front of mosquegoer, right? Like, we're implying that there are peaceful mosquegoers, so there must be also violent mosquegoers, right? That there are congregations out there that are violent. I'm like, let's think about what we're doing. When we talk about peaceful Muslims, right, or peaceful congregations at a masjid, what we're in effect doing is we're saying there are only two kinds of Muslim. You're either peaceful or you're violent. And I'm like, we don't do that for anyone else, because that's a ridiculous statement to make about any human being, about you're either peaceful or you're not. And so I wrote an entire piece about this because, and to me, I did that because that is why I became a journalist, was the language. I became a journalist so that the language, I'm like, we shouldn't be dehumanized when we're alive, and we shouldn't be dehumanized when we're being killed either. Right. And that doesn't matter if you're an American Muslim or you're an Afghan Muslim, Iraqi Muslim, like whatever your background is. Right. So for me personally, it's very important as a journalist that I am on top of those things, that I am aware of the output of the company that I'm working with. And is it complicit in the dehumanization of my community or not? And I realize, again, that that's not an easy position to be in, because I don't think you should be the token, Muslim editorial person. Like, okay, everything goes through me because I happen to be the Muslim, because again, it's also unpaid labor that you're participating in. That said, for me personally, I think it's like, I can't not do that, right? Because that is the entire reason I became a journalist. And I also don't have that expectation of every Muslim journalist that they should be doing that. I'm like, no, I understand, like, that's actually a really hard job, because it's unpaid labor. It's not your job. You also are running the risk of, like, sometimes in journalism, you have really tiny, fragile egos, and you're kind of running the risk of hurting people's feelings, even though all you're doing is trying to make the job or make the output better, right? You're trying to do the job right. And so I don't have that expectation of Muslim journalists, but I think that if you went into this industry to change the way stories are told about Muslims, and sometimes that means taking on a little bit of that burden, but to the extent that you can. And if you can't, that's fine too. Like, we shouldn't beat ourselves over it. Instead, we should create the stories and write the stories, and hopefully the way in which we're writing and telling those stories will also resonate with others who are in our newsroom, right? Oh, okay, Sana's doing Muslim stories like this. That's really interesting. That's a cool approach. I didn't think of it that way, so on and so forth. One thing that I really, really want to do, and I always have all these projects going on and I never seem to finish them, but I really want to, and I've actually applied to a few conferences with this workshop, but for some reason it never goes through, which is really interesting. But I really want to do a workshop on, like, reading Islamophobia in the newsroom, right? And it's and kind of looking critically about the way we tell stories about Muslim communities, Muslim world, quote unquote Muslim world, and all this stuff in the newsroom. And that's something I've always wanted to. I've wanted to provide it to my own newsroom. I wanted to provide it to, like, young journalists, because I used to do that like 5-6 years ago. I used to do that on the regular. But I've and I think that's something else that we can do is, for those of us who have the skills and the ability and the knowledge and the little bit of maybe that a power to do so and privilege to do so, to also go out and create the workshops that we attend workshops for every other skill, anti-racism workshops, whatever. We should also be creating the workshops to for journalists to start unlearning the language of Islamophobia that they unwittingly will apply in their reports, right? Whether they're good or bad stories.
Oh, that's would be a fantastic workshop. That is so needed. And I wholeheartedly agree with you about, as much as it is an unpaid burden, it's something that compels us to essentially act, because, like you, I also couldn't stay silent. I felt strongly at the time of the massacre. And I remember, because we were just 2 hours behind, but I was watching it unfold in real time at work. And, in the foyer, there are all these TV screens everywhere. And we just switched to the New Zealand public broadcast, and it was just like streaming in live. And I was really disappointed in how the ABC approached those initial hours of reporting, because, to be honest, nothing substantial about the victims really came out until after the first 12-hour period, which I'm sure that was essentially very crucial. What was dedicated to that was really humanizing, really going out of their way, actually, to humanize the killer, because he was from Grafton, New South Wales, which is a rural area in our state, and they just spent the first 12 to 24 hours really trying to reason as to why someone would be compelled to do that, and rightfully took on the white supremacy in Australia angle. But I couldn't find out anything about the victims. The only way I found out about it was through social media and through those contacts that I have. And I was just really upset with how that went. And that's what compelled me to agree to write for Vice New Zealand, which is why I have that one article. And I was asked all the time, especially at work, as to why I chose that medium and whether I realized the significance of me doing that, as if it was a potential consequence to put out an opinion piece so early in my career and how that would potentially have ramifications. But at the time, that's not what I was thinking. My goal was to really undo what my own workplace was doing at the time, and I didn't feel properly represented. They tried to rectify it later on, but my goal was that at the time, the New Zealand Muslim community were in shock. All their efforts and all their goals was to try and deal with this horrific event, and they just asked me to take on some of the labor and to try and articulate and put that into words, because I just wanted in that moment to remind everyone that we were human. And it's really sad that I had to go to such lengths to do that, but it's essentially a burden that necessarily had to be done. And, a year on, to be honest, the conversation hasn't moved forward, unfortunately. I'm sure you probably already knew that because we take pretty bleak outlooks, but there hasn't been anything significant in terms of addressing the root causes as to why this happened or the after effect. It's still very much widespread and healthy in today's Australia. But going on to that as well, another thing that, that whole incident brought up for me as well is that even though we try with as much integrity and with as much accuracy and value as possible, we also get lumped into the stories that we're trying to tell because they're unreported or misreported because of our identities as Muslim women, and it can't be separated from our work. We essentially also become part of the political football. You also become part of your story, and that also is a whole other tightrope to walk as well. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that and how your experience has been when you become the story, or whether you've had any experiences on that.
I think what's interesting, I've definitely been told in the past, you're too close to the story, right? Being Muslim. And I think whenever you are part of a community that's not white, right? It's always interesting how everyone else is told you're too close to a story, but white people are never told that. White people who cover racism, it's aren't you a little too close to white supremacy to be, by virtue
Honestly,
of being white? Right? No one says that. I'm but nope. Actually, right? If you're a beneficiary of a white supremacist system, aren't you too close to tell that story? Aren't you? So it's always a funny thing whenever I've been told I'm too close to a story to talk about it. And I'm excuse me? What is that supposed to mean? But I will say that one thing that is very interesting is so I, for most of my life, for 14 years, wore hijab, and I did a lot of media work while wearing hijab, and before I joined AJplus, I had taken it off. And what was very interesting was how that process really, that instance really changed my interaction, not only with people in general and society, but also with this industry, right? And I was no longer necessarily read as a Muslim woman per se, right? And if I was, it was because of what I was saying, right? Because that didn't change. What I was talking about didn't change at all. The only thing that changed was what I looked like visibly in public. And I do remember, for instance, all of a sudden it was a lot harder to get, when I was pitching stories about Muslims and the issues of surveillance and national security, et cetera, it was really hard to get any editors to be interested in me anymore, right? And I noticed that immediately. I was this is really interesting. All of a sudden, it's very hard for me to talk about the issues I've been talking about and I've been published for the last, however many years. And so that was very interesting. And I did find that I wasn't being you know, I mean, again, I was at AJplus in 2014. So it's, there's an understanding there that we're not going to necessarily, tokenize you. But like, I don't think, so I can only speak to that experience, but I don't think since then I've been read as a Muslim journalist, right? By, unless people look at my, Twitter account and then they see what I talk about. And because I do focus mainly a lot on, I talk about issues of national security, foreign policy, leftist politics. But then you will also see oftentimes a lot of explicit conversations or like explicit discussions of issues that are very particular to the Muslim American community, for instance, right? So, but I don't think I'm read as a Muslim journalist, quote unquote, when people look at me, obviously, because I'm not visibly Muslim. I'm visibly something else, right? But I'm not visibly Muslim. So, and that's also a really interesting, then of course, like my colleagues, everyone knows that I'm Muslim because I don't hide that. Like, I'm like, yeah, I'm Muslim, So I think once people find out that I'm Muslim, then yes, they're reading me as Muslim because then like, oh, she's not just Muslim culturally, but actually practices, so on and so forth. And I think then approaches to stories become maybe a bit different. It's been kind of I have both experiences. I have the experience of like being tokenized and kind of treated in a very particular way because I was visibly a Muslim woman. And I didn't realize I was kind of being treated that way until I took it off and I saw how differently I was treated. Right.
Wow.
And then I realized I had to really just play a different game, so to speak. Like, it was just a very, very different experience initially as a Muslim woman who was in the news, talking about Muslim issues, and then later, like not being a visibly Muslim woman, in the media. So it's been a really interesting experience in that regard. Because for me, like my Muslimness is very much so at the forefront of who I am. It's like what I consider my primary identity. And so it's always interesting, like how, in some ways, I guess that can help me too, in terms of, the fact that if I'm not being initially being read as Muslim, but it sounds terrible to say, but it is the industry we're in. It's like, you can almost be seen as, to an extent, a bit more palatable, so to speak, right?
Yep.
Like to tell a certain
story.
You know what I mean? And I hate saying it, but it's true. And I also do think about, because I always think about, when and will I wear the hijab again? And I don't let my career be a factor in that conversation, but I do think about like, what would that impact be? Right? Because it's very true that the way in which a veiled Muslim woman is being consumed by a viewer, by a reader, is very different than someone who isn't. Because unfortunately, people will just imbue all of their biases. No matter who you are, right? Even if you're like anything, whenever you're any kind of whenever you're a visibly different, quote unquote, person, from whatever the majoritarian identity is, like people will imbue certain meanings onto who you are, what you represent. And so, even if you're just a woman, people will read something about national security, get to the end and see the byline as a woman and have perhaps a very different approach to what they just read. Right. So I think about those type of things very often as well. Like, what would that impact be? Not that I would even care, but like, it would just be such an interesting, experience having, like I said, worn hijab and been in the media, and then not wearing hijab and being in the media. And I also get asked the question, like, do you think that you got opportunities the way that you did because you don't wear a hijab? And to an extent, I think, yeah, I actually do think that. And it's, again, not a very fun thing to say, but I do think to an extent I was able to get a particular, because when I wore hijab, I wasn't like the super fashionista hijabi, right? Like I was super chill, like whatever. And so I don't also, and there's a whole other conversation, but I think like even the pressures that are on women in hijab who are in the public eye to look a certain way, just like there are on women of all kind, we have a pressure to look a certain way. And I don't feel very blessed that I'm glad I don't look like anything that they expect you to look like. But I do think that I think maybe if I was a Muslim woman in hijab who very much so fit that Instagram look, I think I could have had also I could have gotten more opportunities as well if I was still wearing hijab. But I do think that as it stands right now, there are certain opportunities that I've gotten not as a result of, but I think that I don't think I would have gotten them as easily were I wearing hijab. And I didn't realize that until much later in my kind of career.
Yep. And you know what? Those are conversations that we ultimately have to grapple with. That, again, is probably not on the radar for anyone else in our industry, but it's yet another thing that we need to keep in mind as we're trying to balance everything in moving forward. But you've touched on really interesting points that I also wanted to segue into, and that is, speaking of Instagram and, the version of the palatable hijab, inevitably our work is going to intersect with how it impacts the Muslim community. And especially, within the past decade or so, we've seen a migration of sorts from it just taking place in our regions, but now online. Mm-hmm. So Muslim Twitter, Muslim Facebook, Muslim Instagram, mm-hmm. they are now interesting niches that function and self-regulate in a way in their own right. And I always found it really interesting, but also really difficult in learning how to engage with the Muslim community when we're trying to balance internal conversations that we're trying to have or that we're trying to address within members of our own community, but they're taking place on external platforms. Right? It's just this weird juxtaposition. And, Muslim Twitter is the perfect example of this, mm-hmm. because anytime a controversy happens or, there's an event that happens or topics that circulate, I just find it really discombobulating when we're talking about, women's decision to wear the hijab or not, or, women's place in society, or how capitalism is basically destroying the role of Muslim women, or, actions of certain religious leaders. When that goes viral on Facebook, it doesn't only just invite, or Twitter, for example, it doesn't just invite critique or this platform where we're all trying to, basically voice our concerns or talk about it, but it's happening while, weirdly enough, the rest of society is watching. And I want to know how you grapple with it when you're trying to engage and trying to point out or have meaningful discussions about what we need to change or problems that are facing our community. But the only way we can do that is having to risk it by going on external platforms.
Yeah, that's always it's a really good question. And it's one I think about a lot too, because, on whether it's on Twitter or on Facebook, I talk about a lot of internal Muslim American issues, Muslim issues, very openly. And in recent years, I've actually made a conscious decision of also just being more open about more authentic, I guess is a way to put it, about even my own practice and relationship with the deen and everything. But with regards to talking about sometimes those really ugly issues in our community, I am always very conscious of the fact that I'll give you an example, right? Talking about issues regarding the LGBTQ community or LGBTQ issues in the United States. And when it comes to the Muslim community and attitudes and so on and so forth, that's something that's a conversation that requires such a nuanced approach and delicacy and compassion for everyone. And I know, for instance, that I have a lot of people in my life who would possibly see me say certain things that are directed towards the Muslim community, and they would be like, what are you saying? And it's just and it's understanding that all communities have different languages, right? And I think we sometimes forget that even though we're all maybe in the same country, we don't all speak the same language. The way a community is defined is through the very particular language that it creates, because communication is what builds relationships and interactions between people. So I am always very conscious and sometimes worried, I'm talking about certain things So for instance, like whether it's women's issues, whether it's LGBTQ issues or whatever, and how it's impacting the Muslim community and vice versa. And I know that like when I'm talking to a Muslim audience, like I write it so that it is for that Muslim audience. Right. And I do that sometimes nervous because I know that there's a non-Muslim audience also reading that. And sometimes, I mean, in the past, I feel like I've also, again, it goes back to I've kind of built a certain public persona where even non-Muslims who follow me kind of understand what I'm doing and understand like they respect me hopefully enough to like, not want to troll me or something, that they'll kind of be like, okay, let's see where she's going with this or whatever the issue is. But also I think they respect me to know that I'm, that maybe there are certain beliefs that I hold that, oh, sorry. I just like totally just blanked on where I was going with that.
No worries.
Let me just restart that point. So when I am writing these things on social media about like very internal conversations regarding Muslim American issues or Muslim American interactions with broader societal issues, whether it's issues of foreign policy, whether it's issues of, some like CVE, countering violent extremism is something I'm very vocal about, and the way that a lot of Muslim Americans have engaged with the state apparatus and have really made our community so vulnerable. And I'm very, very open and very harsh about it. And I'm harsh about it very, very intentionally. When I talk about those issues, when I talk about issues regarding women, when I talk about issues regarding LGBTQ, I always catered that language to the Muslim community. But I also am very at the same time aware of the fact that there is a huge non-Muslim audience that is reading that. And I've been blessed in that, I have an audience, Muslim, non-Muslim, who I think are aware of the fact that I don't deal in extremes, right? Like I try to approach all issues and conversations with a healthy dose and level of nuance, and that I have very strong principles that I don't move on, but I am still open to having my own beliefs and perspectives challenged. And I think because I hope that's how people know me. And I think if my audiences know me like that, when they see me talk about these issues in our community, that they are then a bit more, they're interested in actually seeing where that conversation goes. Whereas I think if I was presenting things in one extreme or the other, then they would feel the need to present their opinions and interject in the extreme as well, if that makes sense. I hope that's answering the question, if I understood it correctly.
Yep, no, that is it. You've hit the nail on the head in regards to, dealing with that juxtaposition.
I do think that, like, as, if we're having these conversations in a public sphere, then we need to be able to, kind of also understand that there are people like who are non-Muslim, who are not part of this community, who are listening and watching. Like, for instance, on Twitter, there are so many conversations that I see develop on Jewish Twitter, so to speak, right? And especially like leftist Jewish Twitter. And I see it and I don't feel the need to participate, And I also understand oh yeah, like this is a community that have their own interesting interactions with certain issues and so on and so forth. And this is a very particular part of that community that's having this conversation. And it's interesting for me to read and to observe, but I don't hold opinions on it per se. I mean, and that's, I can only speak for myself, but that's how I also look at other communities and the conversations they're having. And I don't feel the need to interject and be like, well, here's how I feel about your issue. Or actually, I think you should be saying this instead of this. So yeah, I think we all just have to be aware of the fact that every time we're engaging in on a public platform, which is every platform we exist on, that we are always inviting people into that conversation without explicitly inviting them. And that's something we have to be aware of. And if you want to kind of cater your language in a way that's softening the blow, then go for it. But I do believe in being really kind of honest and authentic in how you're speaking, and not really caring about and obviously there's certain things that are very, very sensitive, right? When we're talking about, issues of whether it's violence, whether it's like sexual abuse and whatnot, like there are certain issues that we do, I think, need to always mindfully like approach, because one thing I also know is there are always journalists looking for a story as well. And sometimes your story can end up in the wrong hands and be turned into something that's used and weaponized against your community. So I do think we need to be a little cognizant, but I also don't think we should stay away from being honest and authentic about the tough conversations we need to have as a community to better our community, because we don't have town halls, right? Like, it's not like we're like, all right, everyone who's a Muslim in Virginia or in New York, we're going to meet at this time and have a community conversation. We don't have that. So in lieu of that, like, what do we have? We have these very public spaces. And so it's like, all right, how do we engage with them responsibly but authentically?
That is a great point to land on, because, even with that, as you said, that it's a public space, there is also a lot of repercussions that comes with the territory, especially when we're trying to address those more sensitive or more critical conversations that need to be had, where, honesty is pretty much required. But as usual, I find that the repercussions or consequences, especially in terms of reactionary abuse, always seems to be more disproportionate towards Muslim women, because we find ourselves in this very double-edged dichotomy, because we're trying to address, at least a lot of the time with what I've seen, and it only came up because of the public spaces that we're trying to address this on. But we're both trying to grapple with dealing with internalized misogyny, and we're trying to speak to that. But in doing that, we also risk externalized misogyny from the rest of the public space, or at least society. And there's no break, at least I find, when I've really gotten into it. And, that obviously gives or brings about its own spate of online abuse. And I was just wondering what your experiences were on that, and how do we make any meaningful segue? Because, just earlier this week, I just find the same conversations just get recycled over and over again. Like, in the spate of one day, I saw Muslim Twitter talking about how women over 25 are expired, and if they weren't married, then something's wrong with them, to women who quote unquote deluded themselves into working, really just sold themselves out to capitalism, and they really should just be more calm and live within their means, right? Yes.
Oh my God, I have so much to say. This could be a whole other podcast.
I know.
So much to say about this. Because it is so frustrating, because, okay,
I know.
To your point regarding like that internalized and externalized misogyny, I mean, yeah, like, people don't realize to what extent we have to deal with misogyny constantly, whether it's professional misogyny, whether it's misogyny within our community. These approaches, like, like this idea that you're 25 and then you're expired. I'm like, okay, what? Like, that's something. I'm 33. Like, I just turned 33 in June, right? And it's funny, because I was having this conversation with a friend, and I was like, it's so weird. Like, I don't feel quote unquote old, right? Like, I think age is also to an extent your own experience and how you choose to engage with it. And I'm like, I don't feel old at all. And, I'm enjoying my life, having a good time, whatever. And, we both agreed that what makes us ultimately feel quote unquote old is our community, right? Is that there are certain not expectations, but that there are certain ways in which our communities will talk about us, our small communities, not like greater American society, because in greater American society, being 33 is like, oh my God, you can have a TikTok. That's so cute. Like, it's like, it's not considered old in the way that we talk about women sometimes in our community, unfortunately. Sorry, that was like, we don't have to include that. I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. Like,
no, of course. But like, if we don't address it, like, because it actually really does weigh you down. I just find myself
does,
getting so
because
exhausted about being defined by biological clocks, as if the men in our community don't have them, like they're just immune, and they're like, by the time that they're raisins, they're still able to do the same things as when you're 20. No, sir.
Yeah,
That's
no,
not happening.
absolutely. And it is really, really, it's very frustrating, because I don't think people realize is that when you have put that kind of a judgment of worth on a woman, that you are not only like, you are actually not only like having an impact on her mental health, but you are also actually having an impact on her material well-being and her growth, right? So like, when you talk about women being expired at a certain age, that has an impact not only on her mental health, not only on, the prospects of her finding a healthy partner, but also on her ability to grow professionally, and to actually, because you think that, well, what worth does this woman have if she's not married, if she's not having kids by this certain age, right? And it's just like, and I'm like, that's such a dangerous idea. And it absolutely goes beyond the Muslim community as well. But it's such a sad idea that's persisted. And what actually really worries me is like, I see a lot of young Muslims who've absolutely adopted that idea, right? That they're critical about everything in the world, but they're not critical about the way they engage with women's bodies, about the way Muslim women's bodies, age, all those things. Like, there isn't any kind of critical engagement in that. And I keep thinking about, like, I'm sorry, would any of these same people have told Khadija radiallahu anha, like, that she was expired?
Oh, absolutely not.
Think about that. I'm like, would they have told her? No, of course not. And I'm
Nope.
like, and we are going around telling young girls that they're expired. And I'm like, that's so gross. And again, it reduces women's function in the world to only reproductive, right? That the only thing that women are actually like, their worth is only ultimately in their ability to reproduce, which is so dangerous, like, overall, but especially as Muslim women, when it's like, no, our worth is in the same thing that men have it in, which is like being believers. As Muslims, like, our worth is in our belief, not in our ability to reproduce or not, right? Like, it's just such a because, and then you end up creating this like double tier of like Muslimness, right? Which is like, a Muslim woman's worth is in her ability to reproduce, and a Muslim man's worth is in his, his obedience to Allah, right? Like, and I know there'll be certain people on the pendulum who will say like, well, or on the spectrum rather, who will say, marriage and reproduction is also your obedience to Allah, and that's a whole other conversation. But I mean, I think like it's really frustrating that we are still at this point in the conversation, and that it doesn't seem to be going away. But the way we talk about sometimes Muslim women within our communities, and what we place their worth in.
Of course, I grapple with this all the time, and especially when we voice objections to it, or the thing that really, really frustrates me about Muslim Twitter, especially when we're talking about women's rights. Like, for me personally, whenever I'm talking about that, I always came at it from the perspective of, I'm trying to re-ascertain my right that was given to me in Islam by Allah, right? It's just, right to work, right to own property, right to behave in a certain manner, right to be treated with respect, what have you. This is all founded within our tradition, right? Nothing frustrates me more that anytime we're trying to address wrongs against women in our community, that the response to us even bringing that up within tradition is that it's too feminist. Like, I just came up with that out of nowhere.
I can go on about this.
It's just so frustrating.
It is very frustrating. And it's very, very frustrating, like, the fact that, and because the word feminist is used in a pejorative way only, right? Like, it's not used.
It's used to dismiss any kind of discourse, any kind of meaningful discourse that will address the actual inconsistencies.
And because
injustice.
it's like, oh, well, feminism is actually just a result of secular liberalism, which I'm like, yeah, I agree with. Okay. But it's like, because it's a result of secular liberalism, therefore it is antithetical to the spirit of Islam. And so when you label a woman within our community, right, like as a feminist, what are you saying? You're saying she's anti-men, she's anti-Islam automatically. When in reality, it's like, hi, I just want space to pray in the masjid. Like,
Seriously, I just want a place to, like, me and 5 of my friends to pray, and we're not like busted up against the broom closet.
Not in a place that smells, that's not so small, and like, there's mildew everywhere or something. It's like, that's not really, and like, is that feminine? Like, that seems like to me also just me asking for like my ability to do my ibadah properly. Like, that's what I'm asking for. And I think like we have a really toxic situation. I'm actually working on an article about this, which I hope to publish in the next couple of weeks, which is actually addressing this issue head on, which is that, like, what have we become that we are allowing certain personalities in our community who are taking on explicitly misogynistic, not Islamic in any sense, approaches to how we talk about women and women's issues. And we are okay with that we're absolutely okay with it for some reason. And it's very, very frustrating. And people don't realize how it does make just existing as a Muslim woman, period, very difficult. When you can't like say something without someone being like, well, you're just a feminist, or you're just like, whining, and you're like, I'm just okay. Like, having an opinion is what's offensive to people now, right? It's like, it's always been offensive when women have opinions. But it feels like now, especially in the Muslim community, like there's this huge backlash, which is really interesting to me because, like, for me, again, like growing up in the 2000s, there was a massive emphasis by our community on educating Muslim women, on pushing Muslim women to the forefront of and making us public, because the idea was, oh, we got to fight the stereotypes. And we got to prove to them that Muslim women aren't oppressed, right? It's like, yeah, we're not. And okay, we'll show them exactly what our community is all about. And now, and I feel like this is especially the case with a lot of younger Muslims, unfortunately, younger Muslim men, especially, there's been this weird like backlash to the fact that Muslim women have opinions and have, economic, independence, and like that we want that and we're okay with that. And I do think that there are certain things that we need to be maybe as a Muslim community more critically engaged with when it comes to certain trends among Muslim women, right? And I think like there is definitely space to have those critical conversations. But what we're seeing right now isn't that. What we're seeing is really a much more of this kind of misogynistic attack on Muslim women who dare to say something, anything.
Oh, for sure. And the thing that really puzzles me as well is, that none of these things that we're talking about are unfounded in tradition, that there's this really large disconnect between what we're asking for that has already been there. And I think the issue really arises, especially when I think back to the 50s and 60s when a lot of Muslim countries were, conducting their own revolutions, and Muslim women were trying to assert themselves back home. And I just find it really fascinating that it was essentially dismissed as a feminist movement, but what they didn't realize is that they really needed that epistemology to re-ascertain rights that already existed in Islam. And I always counter the fact with, well, if we were already given those rights, where are we? Yeah. We shouldn't need to be worried about any repercussions or sometimes fear for our lives, or be so silenced that we need to create secret groups on Facebook and WhatsApp to even carve out spaces for ourselves to really, unpack our trauma and, trying to move a way forward and reconcile with what we know is in our tradition. And that's, what we wholeheartedly believe in versus what's being translated into reality. And I don't think men understand that, or at least they're very much aware of it. And it's either they don't understand it or they're essentially exploiting that for their own gain. And that's really hard to navigate, at least for me anyway.
So repeat the last part of what you said. I just want to make sure I understood it.
Oh, yeah. I said the last thing is that I don't know whether Muslim men when approaching or being in these conversations are either aware that this is happening, or that we're dealing with this kind of trauma, or that they are aware of it and that they're exploiting it.
Yeah,
as part of the power imbalance.
I don't know. I don't know if Muslim men are. I wouldn't say like all Muslim men. Obviously, I think there are certainly certain.
Oh,
people
of course
who,
not.
Like,
Hashtag not all men.
Yeah, I think there's certain people who like found a pulpit and then found a vacuum and try to fill that vacuum with what they see as the basically bottom of the barrel analysis of issues regarding Muslim women and gender and the Muslim community. So I think we do have people who absolutely are taking advantage of it in the most grotesque way and not realizing how they're really inflicting a lot of mental and possibly at some point physical violence against women without any kind of consideration, and how they're actually really bastardizing religion to do that, right? And that's something I have a huge problem with, because I'm that is religious illiteracy, right? Just because you can speak a little Arabic and you know a few verses in the Quran and you can reference a few scholars does not mean that you are religiously literate. When you are actually actually participating in essentially in the dehumanization and of women, and especially Muslim women in your own community that you're participating in, doesn't mean you're religiously literate. I do think one of the things that I'm also really interested in exploring, and I don't think it hasn't actually really been done, is also the impact of Islamophobia on Muslim male masculinity in these countries. Right? That's something I haven't really seen explored. And that's something I'm really interested. I have some ideas about it and I really want to explore this topic, but I don't think we think about, the way in which a lot of, and that's one of my own frustrations, is sometimes the way that in Muslim women circles and groups, we talk about Muslim men, where I don't think, and I have plenty of my own gripes, but I don't think we also consider the fact that Muslim men in the last 20 years, especially young Muslim men in particular, have had to grow up, and even older ones who had to really kind of, rethink who they were, what they are, how they're interacting with society, so on and so forth. What impact did, the national security state apparatus have on Muslim men and their masculinity, right? Because Muslim masculinity was absolutely criminalized. Right? It was made to be dangerous and scary. So what impact has that had on the way Muslim men are viewing and understanding their masculinity? And then because that has an impact on how that masculinity treats us, right? It has an impact on how that masculinity interacts with us as Muslim women. And so that's also something I think about, is I think there are a lot of Muslim men who are possibly in this kind of, when you exist especially in a space where you feel that you have, this is not to discount the fact that we have every community where there are men, that there is organically a problem of misogyny. So it's not to discount that, but I do think there's possibly something to be said about what happens in a community where men have been emasculated, quote unquote, through a security apparatus, right? Through systemic discrimination, through an entire, in our case, a war on terror, that their manhood, so to speak, has been criminalized, and therefore they hold no real material or real power in the way that is defined for men. What impact does that have then on the way they interact with women who seek equal status, but is seen as though they're seeking power? I know it's kind of philosophical.
You've
and really
articulated that so well.
But it's something that I think about a lot. And it's I really, really want to kind of pursue this further, because I'm we haven't thought about that. We haven't thought about, when we look at the war on terror, right? It's Muslim women absolutely bear the burden of racist attacks and that kind of the way in which we've been also, especially visible Muslim women, have been kind of criminalized and demonized in the public sphere. But the actual security apparatus of the war on terror, of the narrative of terrorism, it actually targets Muslim men, right? And we
Mhm.
haven't
Yep.
actually engaged with that. The impact of not Islamophobia, but of an actual violent system of security. And how has that impacted Muslim men in our community? And because that then impacts the way they interact with us as Muslim women, the way they interact with their faith, the interpretations of their faith that they choose to also engage with. So I think, like, again, going back to, I think with all these conversations, there needs to be this like level of nuance. And I wrote a little while ago in this piece on my Medium blog about how, I think we do need to have more compassion overall in the way we talk about these issues, and especially when it comes to like the way in which sometimes Muslim women react to certain things. And it's because we have been let down time and time again by our institutions, but we still hold on to those institutions. Right? We still are the ones who are at the forefront, upholding them and defending them in the face of any kind of, outside attack, especially. But like, and I think sometimes Muslim men don't really recognize the extent to which our experiences with those same institutions within our community that we've built are so vastly different. They're just so different. Like, yes, we pray the same way, but we don't experience prayer always the same way. Right? Because because the space that we inhabit in a masjid, in a musalla, impacts the way we're experiencing that prayer. And it shouldn't, like, ideally it shouldn't, right? Where, you're trying to achieve khushu in prayer. So it shouldn't matter where you are, but it does, because we're human beings, right? And so it's like, oftentimes there isn't that kind of recognition of, we can exist in the same spaces, doesn't mean we're experiencing those spaces the same exact way. And that has a real spiritual impact on us, right? Which is why you see so many Muslim American women really also starting to kind of move away from the faith and find their meaning in something else.
That is so true. I was going to say that I think it's because of that positioning. We're also essentially afforded, well, it's not really a luxury, but because we occupy such a strange space in terms of that, we essentially are also at times, by secular liberal society, and I think we also forget about this as women, is that we are essentially weaponized against Muslim men as well.
Yes.
And when we're dealing with these, internal conversations, and it's just at a stalemate, it's very easy for us to go and flip to the external side, to the outside, and just be like, well, I can't deal with this space anymore. I'm just going to go. And that you have a movability. There's a palatability to you, because at the end of the day, we are essentially, or at least reduced to, a token against the violent, evil Muslim man caricature that is built within these narrative structures.
Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing, is why I kind of wish sometimes, and I understand like the anger that comes from a lot of Muslim women, and because I feel it too. I'm like, girl, I get you. Like, I know, right? Like, it's not easy being a Muslim woman in this community sometimes. But I'm also very cognizant of the fact that we are oftentimes used exactly for that. That we are weaponized and kind of used as native informants as well, right? Against our own community, and particularly our men. And to make that point about like, look, Muslim men are awful to their women. And I think that's a really tough, and I think because of that, like knowing that also Muslim men are also, I don't like using the word victims, but that they are also victims of a system of a structure of violence. I think it's something I have to remind myself constantly, so that I can also be a bit more merciful in the way I approach these questions, right? About
it's so hard. I mean, you have to, but it's so hard.
It's hard. And it's funny because it's also women who always have to do this, right? It's like, okay, we have to do this. But it's like, for me personally, intellectually, I'm like, for me to be intellectually honest, that's what I need to do. It's not even just about me as a woman being like, all right, I'll compromise, but really intellectually to be honest with the fact that like the men in our community, like, I mean, forget even just like the post 9/11 security apparatus that targets Muslim men. We have histories of colonialism in our country, in our communities, that we've never actually confronted, right? the process of decolonization never finished. Because we're still in kind of a more neo-colonial state. All the countries that most Muslim American countries are in some state of a neo-colonialism like rule, right? Whether it's economic systems, whether it's the dependence on the United States or other countries for security or whatever. We're not, even our communities back home, so to speak, don't exist independently. So we have like layers upon layers of really generational trauma and experience that we haven't confronted. And I know that's like a lot to think about when you're like, but I just want to hate on someone right now. But it's something that I do try to be aware of when I'm talking about these issues. And I don't necessarily always have to be explicit about it, but I do think about the way in which I talk about Muslim men as a group and how, and that's why I've been trying to even complicate my own interaction with that question. And so I've been thinking a lot about, like I said, like what does Muslim quote unquote Muslim male masculinity look like, and how has it been impacted by the security state apparatus, right? And that's something like when I think about it, and the only reason I started actually thinking about it was really when I started delving into more everything that was happening post 9/11 with regards to everything from Guantanamo. I mean, Guantanamo is a perfect example. From Guantanamo to the ways in which Muslim men have been continued to be targeted by, for entrapment purposes by the FBI, the way Muslim men are the target of all kind of foreign wars as well. And so I have to think about this because we oftentimes will think about men as disposable in situations of war as well. And that's something like I've tried to unlearn myself, because we always say you got to protect the women and children and the elders, right? Which is, true, because they are vulnerable in our society. But then I also think about how sometimes that approach can make men a lot more disposable. And obviously, like, I'm not here to be like, defend all men, but I am here to think like, kind of bring a bit more of a compassionate approach to the critiques that maybe we put forward and how we can couch them.
That was
Valid
actually
points, excellent points.
Sorry,
go ahead, Tanzim.
No, because it was interesting. Mashallah, it was a really insightful conversation in terms of like feminism and masculinity. Like, I guess it's really interesting you're talking about being merciful, compassionate. Because even as a guy, I don't really like what you just articulate. To be honest, I don't really think from that perspective at all. Like when I think about, I guess the Muslim community and what they go through, I tend to more think about what the Muslim women are more vulnerable in the sense of in accordance with like Islamophobia. I feel that Muslim women are more tend to cop the most and are more vulnerable in that sense. So from I guess from a Muslim male perspective, I don't think too deeply about being disposable in war. Like for example, I don't know. This feels really weird. I feel like I'm refuting you, but I'm not really. But we're arguing two different points of view. But anyways, like I'm just saying, like, because I guess like right now it's like war is not really a thing, so it's like it's not the first things that pop in my mind, but I definitely understand, I guess, your sentiments where you come from. But I guess because I rant about feminism all the time, like in terms of like on Twitter, where I see some person write some dumb thing about feminism is contradictory to principles of the Sharia, for example. I'm just like, oh, this guy, and then I just have to reply, but I can't stop myself. It's just like, I guess at the end of the day, it's like for responsibility for a man is that they have to understand that there are just certain privileges you do have. Like, I guess just like, for example, in the masjid, if a woman who doesn't wear hijab has to work 50 times harder to be a part of, like, have to sort of work harder to be in the community, right, compared to a guy who may rock up to the masjid with shorts. And I know there's the Maliki opinion and stuff about that's a different side point, but let's just say he had tats as well. He doesn't have to work nearly as hard as a Muslim woman who doesn't wear the hijab, who goes into masjid, you get what I mean? So I guess these conversations aren't really happening in the manner that I think we would all like it to happen on Twitter. It's all on Twitter, all I see is, oh, feminism is contradictory to Islam, and the conversation ends there. But like from my sort of readings, I've understood that like within the field of feminism as well, where there are, like, for example, you have in India there was a kind of the Delhi rape situation, and a lot of workshops and a lot of activism happened on that front in India, and this is a result of feminism, which is very much Islamic, right? But it's like when we sort of have the conversation on a very superficial level, it's like it's so pointless. Like, we have to understand like the deeper level, and then understand that, look, these kind of things that are happening on the activism on the ground is actually a result of feminism, which is very much Islamic and we should be a part of. But unfortunately, our community probably doesn't even do it to the degree or have done the research as much as people who are not Muslim and are in the field of feminism are actually doing activism on the ground, if that makes sense. So I guess like these conversations aren't really had. It's more just on a very superficial, basic level, and the conversation ends there. So I don't know, I just went on a bit of a rant. I just wanted to add that from a male perspective as well. But yeah.
Just to respond to your point about like the war issue, I mean, I was using that as an example in terms of, my point is more about, I think that there is the idea that like men don't have to think about also their position in society and kind of how they're being impacted by certain things is obviously a point to like male privilege, right? Like that oftentimes men don't actually have to think about these things. But my point about the disposability, I was just making a point about how we don't think about, and yeah, there's no, maybe boots on the ground people. Well, there are boots on the ground wars happening. But what I mean by that is in terms of men being disposable is that I don't think when we think about Islamophobia in the United States, oftentimes we think about how the victims of Islamophobia are Muslim women, which they absolutely are. And what I mean to say is that I think that mentally, right, because there is this kind of idea that in a state of war, whatever war it is, that men are made disposable and that men go to war to die, right? And you protect the women and children and so on and so forth. And I think that in our minds, right, it's something that's kind of really deeply embedded. It's not something we consciously think of, but that men in many ways end up becoming disposable in a way that we don't always consider, and especially minority men. Right? Like men who are minorities in particular countries, they end, especially if they have an entire state apparatus that is like working against them, that they especially become a certain kind of disposable. And we see that, for instance, also in the United States. You see that with Black Americans, Malcolm X said a very long time ago that the most oppressed woman in the world the most oppressed woman in America is the Black woman, right? And part of that is also goes that question of like who is seen as disposable and who isn't. And so my point about Muslim men being seen as disposable was that we don't talk about the impact that this situation that we have like in America in particular, right? That we have lived under a certain kind of security apparatus that specifically targets Muslim men, right? When we think about something like Guantanamo is a prison that exists exclusively for Muslim men, right? Which is illegal under international law still, but it still exists. So it is. And so when we actually think about that, it's interesting that we just don't talk about, well, has that had an impact on Muslim masculinity? And not in a way that you're thinking about it, right? Because even women, when anything that has an impact on our femininity or the way we engage with being a woman, we're not always thinking about that in a cognizant way, right? It's not like I sit here and I think, well, what does it mean to be a woman? And I'm going to do this now or do that. But these are things that end up being conditioned into us because, and this is how power structures work, right? Like certain things happen and maybe you react a certain way because the society or the culture around you has changed. And so you need to like be a certain way now to protect yourself and to survive. That's a very human reaction. So my point about that was more about the way in which we don't really engage with the impact of Islamophobia or this anti-Muslim violent security apparatus that we do have in the world, and especially in the United States. And also you have it in the UK, you have it in Canada. That we don't engage with how that impacts and has impacted the evolution of Muslim masculinity. And it's because that has an impact on how women are impacted as well. So that was just my point with regards to that.
Fair enough. I can't really dispute you. That's a very interesting take. Yeah, I didn't really see it from that perspective before. But yeah, it's interesting you brought up the Malcolm X quote. It just reminded me of a statement I was reading, because locally, I guess because we're based in Australia, where the Aboriginal community have had to struggle a lot to gain, I guess, basic rights due to flowing from colonialization to now, and essentially it just reminded me because there was a Aboriginal feminist writer who was talking about, I guess, the Aboriginal woman is pretty much at the lowest tier of society, and the Aboriginal man is above that and so forth, and the highest would be the white man. So it's interesting that you brought up you mentioned the quote about Malcolm X, because it's kind of reminiscent of, I was going back to my point earlier about feminism, where it's like, are you going to say, oh, Malcolm X is now feminist and he's contradicting Sharia principle? It's not like that. It's kind of a superficial reading, right? Like we should be having a lot more deeper conversation in terms of these sort of especially online, like what I see. That's what always triggers me, but it's unfortunate. But yeah, sorry, that was just kind of my sort of point I wanted to add. But Ryma, was there anything you wanted to add in terms of this? I might have asked the Hamza Yusuf stuff now, but if you have any other questions, Ryma.
No, because we can go on forever, but the issue is that she's got 15 minutes left. So you go ahead, Tanzim.
Okay, no worries, inshallah. So I guess this will be a really big, dramatic kind of switch in topics. But essentially, like, why I wanted to touch on this is because on the show we've talked about, like, I guess I wanted to talk about, I guess, your sort of article on Sheikh Hamza Yusuf that happened a while ago. And why I wanted to bring it up is because, like, I guess we all have respect for Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in terms of the stuff that he's done in the community. And you actually alluded to, you know, I think Zaytuna are playing a big role in the community and stuff like that in America. And I think, however, you did write an article where you were went to Zaytuna to do a talk. It was a panel talk with Sheikh Hamza and another person,
Chris Hedges.
Chris Hedges, that's it, yeah. And essentially it was talking about the discussion was revolving around oppression. And why I wanted to bring that up.
It was revolving around, what does resistance to oppression look like? It was specifically on resistance. And the best
Oh, okay, yeah. And I guess what Sheikh Hamza was when he was giving his when he was talking, he was basically alluding to the point where the best resistance is essentially non-violent resistance. And I guess you came from a different angle as well. Maybe if you could just touch on your experience doing that talk, and then maybe we can elaborate also, like, what was your experience just doing that talk in general and going to Zaytuna and stuff?
So this was when I had just moved to California, and it was, I think, my first or second or third, I can't remember. It was like one of my first events at Zaytuna, which I was very excited to attend. I used to love Zaytuna as an institution. I was very interested, like, just the entire idea of it was very interesting to me. And you know, there were people associated with it, like Imam Zaid Shakir, Hatem Bazian, who I absolutely loved and adored. And so I was very, very excited. And I went there with a couple friends, and we were seeing Chris Hedges and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf speak on the question of resistance and what does the best resistance kind of look like. And Chris Hedges was great. I mean, it was nothing surprising from him, because if you followed his work, it was very much so in line with kind of what he's experienced and whatnot. And Sheikh Hamza started talking about, you know, essentially, and this isn't really surprising now, given this was back in 2014. So this is not surprising now when we've seen Sheikh Hamza speak on certain issues, and especially given his relationship with certain countries. But he was talking about the best resistance is essentially incremental change, right? Like, that's how you change a country, is through incremental change. And you know, I found it just very interesting. I was like, okay, like, I don't agree with that, but that is all right. Like, I'll listen to, I'll consider your perspective. And so I just had a question for him, and you know, the question answer period started, and I think I was the last person to ask a question. I can't remember. And I was like, I was nervous. Like, I had never actually directly spoken to Sheikh Hamza. I'd seen him speak before. I hadn't spoken to him. And I asked him, I'm like, you know, Sheikh Hamza, and I started off this way. I said, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on what you said. And I think that I was trying to be all like, cute, or like, you know, like kind of like very, I thought I was being a little disarming, which apparently I wasn't when I said that. So I was like, oh, okay, well. And so I said, you know, Sheikh Hamza, I'm just going to challenge you a little bit on what you said. And my memory's a little foggy right now. I wrote it and I remembered exactly what I said because I had documented it. So I'm probably not going to give the best relay of exactly what happened in the order anyways, chronologically. But basically I started asking the question. The question I wanted to ask was, how do we support nonviolent resistance without what's the word I'm looking for? Okay. So yeah, my question to him was, you know, how do we support nonviolent resistance without demonizing causes which are furthered through violent resistance, right? And in my head, I was thinking about the Palestinian cause, right? Like I was thinking about how, the Palestinian cause is something I think almost every Muslim, well, as we know, maybe not every Muslim, but most Muslims in the world would absolutely get behind. And obviously violent resistance is absolutely a part of Palestinian resistance. And that's not something we can overlook. And not to mention, like, let's not forget that like violent resistance was inherent to the decolonization process, right? Like Algeria would not have been possible without violent resistance. So in my head, I'm like, so I start off by saying, because he had used the example of the civil rights movement. And I said, you talk about the civil rights movement and how the nonviolence in the United States, the nonviolence of the civil rights movement, ended up getting Black Americans voting rights and so on and so forth. But I'm like, that's a really rosy picture of the civil rights movement, because in actuality, it was very violent in terms of what was happening. The country was burning right before those Civil Rights Act was signed. The country was absolutely burning alongside also a nonviolent resistance. And so this is before I even got to my question, and he interrupted me and he said, I'm going to stop you right there. And then he kind of, he said a few things about, it was really unfortunate because he kind of went off on a thing about ISIS. And this is in 2014. This is when ISIS was red hot. This is when he himself had been threatened by ISIS and had security everywhere. And he kind of made this implication that that he's like, I know where you're going with your question. And he kind of made the implication that the perspective I was bringing forth was an ISIS adjacent perspective. And I will never forget that moment, because I went red and I felt my cheeks burn, and everyone because I was sitting in the back, and everyone turned around to look at me when he said that. And I was like, oh my God, was I just called ISIS? And that's terrifying, because here I am, a Canadian on a visa working in the United States. I just moved back here, and to be accused publicly of having those perspectives, right? Like that has implications beyond like people being like, that's really bad. It actually has implications on my physical safety. And so I was immediately like, oh my God. And then he kind of went on about this for a while. And then he's like, you know what? Sorry, I didn't let you finish your question. Please finish your question. And I was so nervous at this point. I just kind of gave it to him. And then he kind of went on. I don't even at this point, I can't even remember exactly what he said. But I couldn't hear it. Like whatever he was saying, I was numb to it because I was so taken aback by his approach to me and to that question, and how he just accused me of having essentially ISIS perspectives. Because all he heard really initially, right, from me was the civil rights movement was not necessarily all what's the word? That it wasn't entirely, that what was happening in the country during the civil rights movement, during that period of time, was not peaceful, that there was so much violence, and that violence absolutely played a role in the Civil Rights Act also being passed. It wasn't just people sitting on buses in protest and sitting on lunch counters. That violence was absolutely a part of it. And we do a disservice to the history of this country and to what resistance looks like if we, we take away the role that violence plays. And that's all he kind of heard. And immediately I was like, deemed ISIS, and I was like, whoa, this is kind of intense. I'm like, this is kind of intense for me. Like, how old was I? I was like 26 at the time, or 27, and I was like, what is this? And this is someone I really respected as well. And the thing is, like, okay, I was kind of able to move on from him saying that, but the point, and this is what I wrote in my article, is what got me were the people who came to his defense, right? And I think that is something that leads to a bigger, because look, everyone, okay, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, okay, he misspoke. Even though I think, like, if you're such a powerful figure, I mean, he's probably the most powerful Muslim in the country. Absolutely. Everyone knows him. Even if you're not a very religious Muslim, you know Hamza Yusuf. And I do think that comes with responsibility with how you're speaking, especially to speaking to young women. And especially the way you're speaking to people who don't have anywhere near the power that you have. I think for anyone in a position of power, you always need to be really responsible with the way you speak with people and what you're implying. But I could still give him the benefit of the doubt and say, you know what, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe, yeah, he's under pressure because he's also getting threats from ISIS. Okay. And that, I can move on from. But the article that I wrote, what it really touches on isn't, oh, Hamza Yusuf has a problem. No, it's not about that. The article that I wrote touches on the issue of how we do a great disservice to people in power, and especially in our own community, whether they're shayukh or whoever they are, is when we create this cult of like yes men and women around them who are always there to constantly defend this individual and never actually to say, here's some critical feedback and here's a way for you to improve yourself. And here's something that, I disagreed with or what, like there's this fear sometimes in our community to do that. And it's like, we forget that, being critical of someone's actions doesn't mean being mean, right? It means like, to me, like being not critical of someone, but being critical of someone's actions is showing them that you love them enough to let them know that like, you kind of made a mistake here, buddy. Like, let's talk about this. And so that article that I wrote that's about, this experience with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is actually about the way in which we kind of create these, for lack of a better word, or maybe it's the best word to use, these cults around personalities and in which we make them infallible, which is very, very, very dangerous for many reasons.
Yeah, like I can only imagine like that sort of experience from your perspective, like that would have been like really intense, I guess. Like at the end of the day, I guess what you were trying to do is just propose a different perspective or a different opinion. And I guess you mentioned like kind of nonviolent resistance, like, I guess from my sort of readings as well, essentially, like for example, in the West, like Gandhi gets propped up a lot because of quote unquote like nonviolent resistance, but in actuality, essentially the oppressors like nonviolent resistance because they're still in power. Like how's it hurting them anyway? Like it doesn't make any sense. You get what I mean? Like, so I guess these conversations need to be had, and I guess that's what you were trying to do. And unfortunately, it kind of panned out in a way that I guess is not conducive to kind of discussion of, and being labeled ISIS in some ways not ideal any standards, right? So I guess I wanted to ask like one counterpart. I know we were a bit short in time, but because like we have a WhatsApp group, Boys in the K WhatsApp group, and a brother actually asked an interesting point where I'd like to hear your thoughts. Like, I guess the timing of the article that you wrote was that it was during the time when Sheikh Hamza essentially made those Syria comments. So would you say that what's your sort of take on the timing of it? Because they'll be like, look, that was not the right time to do that. If that happened a while ago, why not just write an article then? Are you just doing it to, get some, I don't know, clout, for example? So that's just some questions or some accusations that you may have had during that whole situation.
A lot, and I was like, no, it's funny because I got that a lot, and I was like, and it was just really funny to me because I'm like, well, okay, if anyone's ever followed my work, they know I'm not doing anything for clout. Like, I don't need clout. I'm not interested in clout. To me, what it was yes, that conversation was happening, but the conversation that I was seeing was more about not these specific comments, but just about like Sheikh Hamza himself, right? Because there are a lot of American Muslims, a lot of us are like really are kind of fed up with a lot of things that Sheikh Hamza says politically, because we do find them very detrimental to, I would say, the political health and safety of a lot of Muslims, and intellectually kind of dangerous as well. And so the conversation that I was seeing was really about that, and then what it means to be, to kind of like, how do we defend people? How do we understand like what they're saying? And so it kind of evolved. It wasn't even about the Syria comments anymore. It was about the discussion about the Syria comments, right? And so for me, I never wrote this article initially because, I'll be real, it was 2014 and I was scared, right? Like, I actually talk about this in my article, like that the amount of people who went to bat for Sheikh Hamza, right? And how I got really, like I had people essentially gaslighting me, and these were men. And actually one of them read my article and he reached out to me and apologized because he's like, I didn't realize what I was doing at the time, and I'm sorry for that.
Really?
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's funny because like, yeah, he's like, I think I was one of those men, right? I'm like, yeah, you were one of those people who actually, and I had so many of these young guys, especially who were very attached to Sheikh Hamza, who reached out to me, who basically told me, sorry, girl, you did everything wrong. Sheikh Hamza was fine. Right. And at the time because like when you get that, like you're not going to really want to be like, well, guess what? I'm going after Sheikh Hamza now. Like, no, or I'm going after his like cult of followers. Like, no, like I'm not going to do that. Not to mention that was 2014 was the same time that I was actually getting, so the same time that this happened, I was getting a lot of flack from the American Muslim community because I had written the article about the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which was about a bunch of Muslim Americans who had gone to Israel on this trip and kind of how it was like this anti-BDS thing, so on and so forth. And that actually ended up really showing me at that time how alone I was, because I had friends ditch me. I lost like a lot of community members who I thought I was very close to, or at least that I had some sort of relationship with, kind of disappeared overnight. And it was emotionally very tough because I was getting hate mail all the time from, by the way, really well-respected Muslims in our community here in the United States. People telling me that I was a fitna creator, that I was this and that. And so for me to write this article at that time, A, I wasn't in a headspace to do it. B, I was not looking to get harassed again, because again, this goes back to the experience that women have when you're public, and especially as a Muslim woman, it's very different, right? Like I can go through my email right now and I can show you the emails I've gotten from Muslim men who I know and who I don't know, who the type of frankness they feel they can have with me with regards to their presumptions about who I am and what I do and why I do it is incredible, right? And that how they feel like they can tell me how to think as well. And so I didn't write this article because I was like, ooh, it's an opportune moment to get because if you look at my Medium blog, right, I just write there when I feel like writing something, when I want to have a perspective to share. It's not something I post in regularly at all because it's not my primary job. It's not also how I build my audience or anything of that sort. That blog is specifically because I don't want to, if I want to talk about Muslim American issues, I don't want to be writing on like Muslim Matters, for instance, right? Not because I'm like, oh, it's a bad platform. Not at all. I just did a podcast with them, but rather it's more, I'm like, that's not the platform I want it on, the particular stuff that I want to do. So for me, I was like, all right, I really don't have a writing platform anywhere else. I'm going to do it on my Medium blog. And this article was already something I had been working on in terms of like, I had all these ideas already out there. I'd had all these conversations with people. And then when the Syria thing happened, with the comments that Sheikh Hamza made, I actually, I was like, oh, this is actually an opportunity, because I saw people talking about, the way in which people were the extent to which people were going to defend Sheikh Hamza. And so I saw people talking about that phenomenon, and I'm like, oh, it's actually a good opportunity to maybe elevate the conversation beyond these comments and actually talk about like, that again, that kind of cult of personality that's created and the way in which we treat leaders and shayukh like as infallible in our community. And so it actually plays into the piece that I published right after, which was about the accusations that were made against Ustad Osama Cannon of Ta'lif, also in California. Right? So both those articles to me are actually very similar in terms of they're talking about not the individual, but they use the individual as like a springboard to talk about the bigger issues of institutions and the way in which we kind of treat spiritual leaders as untouchable, as perfect, and how dangerous that is to our overall spiritual health.
like I think somehow it just struck me that essentially there's so much that I guess you personally have to deal with. Like I guess when it comes to the Muslim community, I guess Sheikh Hamza's followers might go after you, and then I was listening to your other podcast on the Kashmir issue. You had trolls bombarding you, and then you and Ryma were talking about you get that from doing journalism and all that. So it's like somehow I guess you have to deal with this from all angles, even within community, and that's unfortunate. And I guess. Inshallah, we empathize, we try to empathize with what you're going through. May Allah reward you for your sort of works that you're doing in the community. And I think the whole Sheikh Hamza conversation about his political views and non-violence and violence and all that, I think that's a long drawn out conversation that can probably go for an hour, a few hours. But so inshallah, I guess because we're nearing the end of the episode, I do want to ask you one final question. We asked this question to all our guests that come on Boys in the Cave. So if you had to chill with 3 people in a cave, because Boys in the Cave, who would they be? They can be anyone from the past. They can be anyone, present, living now, that you'd want to hang with or chill with in general. And it would be good to kind of get it from I guess the journalism world, I guess like that, who may have influenced you, just to get more insights into who may have shaped your sort of writings and the sort of stuff that you do. The community, I guess.
So who would I think if there was anyone from the past that I would love to meet, to be honest, it would be my late grandfather, my paternal grandfather. I never got to meet him. He died when he was 51 years old. But the more I learn about his life, the more I find myself in it. And it's kind of amazing how sometimes we don't realize how we inherit so much of who we are from people we've never met. And I would love to meet my grandfather who has no idea, or maybe he does, but of how much of him is actually alive in the work that I do, because he was also someone very politically minded, someone who was very passionate about these type of things. My other grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who's still alive, is a writer. So alhamdulillah, I've been able to spend some time with him. But my paternal grandfather would be someone I would love to spend time with. And that would be someone I'd love to meet, because he's had an influence on me directly and indirectly. Directly in the sense that, thanks to him, I was eventually born. But through who he was, I inherited a lot of his character and a lot of his passions in life, and approach to life. And sometimes good and sometimes bad. And so, that would be my boy in the cave I'd like to hang out with.
MashaAllah, I think I guess it's a blessing in of itself that you have family sort of roots in sort of writing and activism and all that. So that's great to hear, MashaAllah. I guess essentially, I've essentially exhausted the question I wanted to ask you. So I guess Jazakallah khair, Sana, for coming on Boys in the Cave. It was really a wonderful conversation. It was we're big fans of what you're doing in the community. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, is that essentially we don't have someone that can kind of represent us in it. I know you said you don't want to, you're not looking to represent people, but I guess speak in a way that Muslims want to be spoken about, if that makes sense. So I guess we know that you're doing that in the community. So may Allah reward you and bless you in your future works, inshallah. So we're glad to have this conversation. And for me personally, just taking a backseat for this particular episode was definitely a really good thing, because it was good to have someone like Ryma, who's in the media and in journalism as well, having that conversation, which is much needed. So thank you for coming on Boys in the Cave.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a really great conversation. And it's you guys definitely asked questions that I hadn't really always considered. So I was kind of, thinking about them as I was answering them. So I'm going to be thinking about them a lot more after this conversation for sure.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And small thing, but can you follow me and Ryma on Twitter, inshallah?
Oh my God, of course.
Good. That's dope. All right, inshallah. All right, I'll probably wrap it up there, inshallah. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook, and you can follow our journey through Instagram, and we'll put our links, Sana's links to all the socials in our show notes, inshallah. So to our very special co-host today, Ryma, and Sana as well, our special guest, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing you off. Assalamu alaikum.